I'm going to be responding to two sources. I'm going to be commenting on the first Trump-Biden debate, and I'm also going to be slightly commenting or responding to the latest sense-making piece published by Rebel Wisdom from Daniel. So Daniel's piece is very good to watch. People should have a look at that. There's a lot of very good information in that. I mean, I'm just like sort of tangential to the points that Daniel is making when he is just sort of giving his overview of the partisanship and the polarization in the current culture. I think that there's a bit of a asymmetry. It's not just like, oh, people are polarizing. The left, the left's narrative is much more delusional than the right's narrative. I mean, obviously, and to sort of to contrast sort of the radicals on the left and the extremists of the left, which are the majority of the so-called left, or the democratic position, with QAnon type people on the right. This is not a fair comparison. But even if you were to do that, I mean, obviously the detail of the QAnon conspiracy might not be correct, but it's almost like, I don't know, you can make a parallel to sort of the muckrakers, or something like that, they're almost like, uh, you know, they're, they're fanciful, plausible stories, but, they're within some realm of, like, well, there are weird things going on with the elites in our society, because identity politics is so uh, uh, destructive and destabilizing, um, and just facilitates so much unaccountable political maneuvering, because through the cause of the identity and that kind of symbolism, you can just kind of basically, to roughly, you can divide and conquer, and corporations can virtue signal and whatever. But anyway, but I'll just say that, there's a huge difference in quality between the narrative of the so-called left and the narrative of the right, or conservatives. It's chalk and cheese. um, and the kind of sort of cherry-picked tautological rationalization which the left inculcates, um, you know, this is unfair to judge the right wing or the conservative politics, because who knows what politics would actually look like if they actually had a reasonable partisan dialogue, if they actually had a reasonable debate partner. If the left actually had a reasonable debate, then the right would actually have to produce some kind of intellectual defense. But because the left is just so ludicrous that, like, it looks like that the right isn't trying to engage, but they have nothing to engage with, is the basic problem. So I mean, if you just look at the how people think that this election is an existential threat on both sides of the polarization, on both sides of the divide, if you just look at what Daniel says about, what the sort of the fear mongering on the so-called left is, it's completely, it's not even in the realm of possibility. It's insane. I mean, Daniel literally has to say something that just, it sounds even ludicrous, him having to say that. I mean, to me, that's a kind of resignation over the fact that the left is just so insane. Anyway, um, that sort of has to be said. That the hyperrealism, which I must say, I link this to the latent fascism, the ideological fascism, which is built into the left wing position. These are fascistic ideologues. Hitler would have called them useful idiots. They are at the very least proto-fascist, but the identitarian worldview is a fascistic conception and conceptualization of society. It's a fascistic interpretation of how to view society, and it means that you can't have democratic politics. You can't actually do anything, because the cause of the identity and a kind of ethnocentric relativism, in which real interests and moral consideration is placed not in a kind of civic nationalism or a civic identity that everyone shares in, so that you can have a kind of secular politics. Instead, you have to have the cause of the identity centered around a kind of reality tunnel, and then, sort of using and making that out to be sort of the only political vehicle to do anything in what they call social justice, uh, um, which is basically the reimagining of. I mean, it's the end of a liberal, open, democratic society, um, ironically being driven by the so-called Democratic Party. But okay, anyway, moving on. So I just wanted to point that out, and I think Daniel is a very sort of level-headed sort of thinker, and that recording is certainly useful for people to focus at it and have a look on. But there is, you know, there is the long-term solution, but then there's also the medium term and the short term. Well, how to make sense of what's happening right in front of our faces. What to do about the choices that we have. Because although you can say, well, it's a lesser evilism, it's not an ideal choice. Um, I mean, I've made very clear arguments as why I think Trump does deserve support. That he's a vital um, vanguard in terms of a cultural reckoning which is required in order to have a hope to revivify common sense, and a sense of civic nationalism under which that you can even have democratic politics of a liberal, open society. Um, so, I mean, there's some ideological things which I wish Trump would have focused on in the debates which came out. I thought of one particular rejoinder, but you can't really. The format of the debate is not conducive to this. In fact, the format of the debate, and also I think Chris Wallace is actually biased. I think that perhaps he has a personal vendetta against Trump because of their particular sort of historical interaction. But I have noticed that the quality of Chris Wallace's journalism is just. I mean, you can't help that people have their own beliefs about certain issues, but I think Chris Wallace is taken in by just the mass of stories, and it's kind of like, well, where there's smoke, there must be fire. It's that kind of sort of weak rationalism, and he can't help but sort of fall into somewhat trying to represent uh, some kind of everyman stereotype interpretation of what's going on in front of him, and that he has to sort of follow the tide or the current of what the headlines look like, or something like that. A very superficial, like to actually referee representatives from these two sort of sides. First of all, Trump is at a huge disadvantage, because if you want to impose equal time, um, I mean, that's an arbitrary standard. I mean, like, what I see Joe Biden doing in this debate is that he just repeated headlines from liberal, rags or whatever, and so essentially he was plastering the field with accusations, and it would take time to diffuse these accusations. It would take time to actually dismantle them. And obviously, he goes through this plethora of things, and Trump doesn't have the time to rebut them or to debunk them, essentially, because he has to have equal time. So if Joe Biden spends all of his time launching accusations, Trump gets smeared no matter what. So the fact that Trump isn't given proper time to deal with each of these accusations, that's a bit egregious. I mean, on a substantive level, because you're going to conform to some superficial thing about equal time. So Trump is then already at a disadvantage, because all Joe Biden has to do is simply just plug himself into the mainstream media machine and just say, well, I've got some sort of majority on my side. And you can just see the vacuousness of Joe's tactics. I mean, whenever Chris Wallace asked him an actual question, I mean, Joe Biden, I think at one point answered, no, I'm not going to answer that question because then that'll become the issue. So you don't even know what you're voting for in terms of that kind of he's not even going to make a substantive thing about what you're voting for. So he's just this kind of mystery box. Joe Biden's, like what he's bringing to the table. Would he pack the courts? Oh, I'm not going to answer that because then that will become the issue. I mean, that's disgusting. I mean, like, that's disrespectful to the electorate. So they must not know what they're voting for, because then that would become the issue. I mean, how shouldn't that become the issue? How can you not know what you're voting for? Or you can get away with this when identity politics is on your side, because then essentially you just represent goodness because you're promoting the cause of the identity. The ideological point that I wish that Trump would have dealt with, and this because Joe Biden set it up so perfectly, where he basically said, when Chris Wallace was bringing up the race issue, Joe Biden said, we have to be sensitive people's self-esteem. He even said this, the sort of the self-esteem. Well, that's all the more reason not to teach people a poisonous narrative about this figment, the scapegoat of systemic oppression, so that they can invest their self-esteem into kind of extracting a kind of ideological self-esteem that's linked to a poisonous narrative, and having to use that narrative to try to extract a fraudulent kind of self-esteem that never fills you up, that never gives you self-confidence. And so you have to keep on repeating the narrative toxically. So, I mean, okay, so you have to kind of, what I just said, you have to put that in context in terms of Joe Biden's response. But that would have been a sort of a very useful sort of rejoinder to make that point that, I mean, perhaps that's a bit too touchy to get into that to draw that kind of ideological blood and to confront it quite directly. But that's all the more reason to remove this cult thinking about creating a toxic narrative about America, which makes it impossible to have any kind of politics other than this kind of disgusting, racialist, bigoted, identitarian, fascistic, kind of doing everything for the real interests of the identity, because you've got this narrative about how the identity has been hard done by systemic oppression, and therefore we have to have this very kind of toxic, destabilizing, unmeritocratic, sort of anti-meritocratic influence over everything, which is sadly going to even exacerbate that narrative. This is the problem with sort of that kind of reactionary vision and of any kind of solution for the identity, is that it makes people more dependent on the identity. It makes people more dependent on making superficial characteristics like race significant. You have to trust the superficial. You have to trust the ideological landscape more than anything else. You can't use your own eyes. You have to use their statistics and their generalizations and their narrative, and you end up having to treat everyone like a representative of some disgusting generalization. It's very toxic, and that's exactly why it must be taken out of the education system. But yeah, so I think that, if people are interrupting each other, and I mean, I think in some sense Chris Wallace exacerbated the interruption. I mean, as a mediator, what he should have done is then he should have said, okay, well then I guess we're going to have less questions, or we're going to go over the time, or something like that. But you just let them exhaust each other by actually giving them enough time to speak out the issue, because they only have to interrupt each other because you're basically saying, no, 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 we can't let you speak more because of equal time. What you do is you let someone talk until they finish, and then you let the other person talk until they finish. And then if one person has taken too much time, then you give that free time over to the other person to make new points or something like that, and you just keep on, and you let them hash it out. You actually let them hash it out, and then maybe they won't interrupt each other. But that all what you do is you ask you hear what they're saying and you sort of try to modify what they're saying by asking them slightly leading questions, in the sense that you try to ask them complementary questions. You try to sort of uh, uh, you try to choreograph a synthesis, in that you ask them questions which are friendly to their position to some degree, to draw out what they have to say to a point, and then you ask a kind of symmetrical question to the other side, so that you can actually facilitate debate, so that you can actually facilitate the intersection of the points. Um, Chris Wallace was not interested in that, and I think he was actually quite rightly. I saw some sources that sort of blamed him for bringing up the good people on both sides hoax, which really is a hoax. I mean, that was manufactured by taking things out of context, and he basically repeated that. Now, I think that very much shows his bias, especially since he didn't couch it as a hoax, or he didn't mention it in context in terms of the misreporting over that issue. Um, but I think that the strategic deaf ear that he gave to substance, in order just to promote a stylistic form of equal time, I think uh, that is fundamentally problematic, and it really gave too much credence to Joe Biden, which he did not deserve. Joe Biden was not specific about anything. He was vague. He was nebulous. It was actually quite disgusting, because essentially Joe Biden just has to invent accusations, and Trump has to try to debunk them. And then Trump actually has some substance behind his position, and Joe Biden is literally he doesn't want to make an issue of what his position would be. I mean, when you ask him a real question, he doesn't get specific, and then he just says, "Oh no, I don't want to answer that question, because then that would become the issue." So it's someone who has a platform being pelted by vague accusations and just blanket, sort of complaints, uh, and there's no target on the other side, and you can't even extract what his actual platform is. It's just it's a nebulous ideological front. Um, I do think the more discerning viewer did pick up on that. I think they did pick up on just how negative Joe Biden's whole platform is, that it has no sort of positive virtue. It's based on essentially trying to bring up as much muck as possible, as just basically echoing the dirty sort of work that has already been done in the, sort of the corporate shitfest that is the mainstream media. Um, I mean, sadly, I think the only way that Trump could have performed better is if he basically said, "Look, I can't deal with all of these blanket accusations when I'm given only equal time to defend against all of these spurless, things," and then focus on just one or two of them, and just say, "Well, if I had more time, I could get into debunking more of this stuff." But just picking his targets, or picking the accusations to diffuse, and then uh, basically just, I mean, and again, I mean, what I guess I would have liked is sadly, I mean, the kind of the best sort of defense that Trump would have done, which wouldn't have been great either, perhaps, is just to point out, well, the New York Times comes up with the story about the tax thing. This is the same New York Times that had a source for the Russian bullshit, for the whole impeachment charade. So the New York Times has an uncorroborated source, like an unverified. I mean, who knows? It's just like the RussiaGate facade. So the same newspaper. I mean, that I think is the only thing to bring up. The New York Times is the source of everything that sort of creates political hay for the Democrats. That's the only pattern that you can see here. Just in time for the debates, the New York Times invents this very convenient um, artifact of fake news. I mean, is sort of all you can really say to kind of fight back in a meta way, in a kind of in a narrative way. Um, but again, that's not a great answer, but it is a bit of a but but this is the problem is that all Joe Biden has to do is have no substance, create as much chaos as possible, and just create as much accusations as possible, and then try to harass Trump when he's actually providing some kind of substance. So it's like water against fire, because he has no fire of his own, he has no substance of his own. So he can just kind of fluidly find the path of least resistance to dismantle any kind of light and illumination that Trump might bring to the substantive issue. And Trump has all the substance that he has to defend, because he actually has a substantive position and a substantive record. And Joe Biden's record is this sort of this fluid. It takes on any container, because it doesn't have. He doesn't want to say what his position is, because then that would become the issue. Then he would actually have a target that he would have to reason on behalf of, instead of just essentially just going with whatever lowest common denominator seems to be the appropriate, kind of retort to make within the context of the debate. So it's I would sort of say, it's incorrect to call him Sleepy Joe. It would be better to call him Slimy Joe. I think it's much. I think that's much more appropriate. That Slimy Joe is. I mean, looking at that debate performance, that's what I see. But I mean, I'm a critical viewer, so that's not to say that would have been the impression of most people. But I think actually there is a threshold that people that have an eye for substance, I think, would have picked up on just how sort of slimy that is, just how easy it is to make those kinds of cheap and and to be so unspecific, to really have sadly the only thing that backs him up is that he's got a mountain of fake news headlines to back up these talking points. So that's a bit scary, that you can just kind of be overcome by the tidal wave of of this kind of external authority of control, which is the kind of the so-called, well, these people call themselves liberal, but the so-called liberal, sort of intellectual superiority. I mean, these are the same people that go on and on and on about coronavirus and about the deaths of the coronavirus. When, if you just look at how many people die in America each year, and you just look at those numbers, you realize that coronavirus essentially made no difference to that. It's really quite crazy the the extent to which uncritical digestion of narratives leads, and liars use statistics. Statistics don't lie, but liars use statistics, and that's exactly what you're dealing with. It's that kind of slimy, sloppy narrative that pretentiously believes itself to be so sophisticated. And sadly, this is my general view of Chris Wallace. I mean, he's just completely sucked into that vortex where he just looks at all those headlines and he says, well, where there's smoke, there's fire. That's basically, I mean, that's how I see his intellect working. And that's also how he seems to sort of adjudicate things superficially. Um, not with an eye to the substance. But I mean, look, Trump is perhaps not an easy person, and I think Chris Wallace has been burnt, let's just say, by perhaps his dealings with Trump before. And I think he is at least well, I mean, there is something to personal sort of sensibilities, that just in terms of personality conflicts. Um, and it does require perhaps a bit more of a sophisticated style to get Trump into a format in which you are actually being fair to the substance, and you are trying to magnify the substance for the substance to come through and for there to be an actual debate. But that's very hard when Joe Biden is committed effectively to not being substantive, to having absolutely nothing. When I say nothing positive, I mean like there's no actual contribution there's no policy platform that Joe is sort of making out. It's just these impossible accusations as well. Um, I mean, in swine flu, did they shut down the economy? No. I mean, that I found was a bit intellectually insane that Joe could complain that it was Trump's recession. You know, I mean, this whole warped narrative. I mean, the most intelligent countries in the world, Sweden. I mean, I don't want to necessarily just focus on the coronavirus thing, but it is true. There should not have been a lockdown. And if you listen to the real experts right from the beginning, they would have told you not to have a lockdown. They did say not to have a lockdown. It must take its natural course. Yes, you can try to protect the vulnerable population. Elderly people and people with pre-existing conditions can be asked to elect to protect themselves. It can be advised and suggested that they self lock down, that they observe a voluntary lockdown. That is probably the most responsible. Um, and then everyone you try to educate to use measures to slow the spread. If you don't want to just slow the spread, you only want to slow the spread if you have stress in medical resources, if the hospitals look like they're going to become overflowing, then you want to slow the spread. Otherwise, you don't want to slow the spread. If you still have lots of hospital capacity, you want the virus to spread because you want to get it over with. And in terms of, you really don't need a vaccine, actually. But you can understand the political environments that they had to go that way, but you don't need a vaccine because coronaviruses are not an issue after 2 seasons. After 2 flu seasons, a particular coronavirus will not be a problem. That's how swine flu works. That's how they all work. That's how coronaviruses work. We know a lot about coronaviruses. The idea that, oh, we're suddenly going to become skeptical about everything that we know because it's got the word in the name, novel coronavirus. This is not scientific. The idea, oh no, do antibodies confer immunity? Oh yeah, we're just going to close our eyes to the fact that in every other coronavirus, antibodies confer immunity, and then they've got so much fake news about how they might not, or how there are studies that contradict that. I mean, that's fake news. That's really, that's triped up, manufactured headlines. That's the misreading of studies. That's the misreading of very strange things. Oh, was this a reinfection? Was this a reinfection? Um, I mean, there are answers to all of this from the real experts who have read these studies, who understand these things. But you never hear from those experts. Somehow the journalists, they don't know the phone numbers of those experts. They don't speak to Sunita Gupta of Oxford. No, they'll instead follow some crazy study from Imperial College. You don't hear from Professor Leonidas from Stanford. No, no, no. These somehow journalists don't know how to contact these experts. They only know how to contact the third-rate experts. And in terms of the actual death count and the actual numbers, when you take into account comorbidity properly, well, I think we can only really fully get a gauge on that by statistically just looking at total deaths. And if we start comparing total deaths, I think we will see very quickly that this whole thing is a politically manufactured. This was manufactured by journalists. This was manufactured by bad faith actors for political opportunism. Because this kind of crisis, it's funny how they're even pushing identity politics through it. I mean, it's delusional. Um, it's because those kinds of ideological adherents, this is their kind of mental scape. This is the kind of situation that they need, because this is how they extract their ideological narcissistic supply. But anyway, I'm not going to go into that. But yeah. So these are all points that, it's hard to bring these up in the face of just, these superficial headlines and the fake news which Joe Biden just has to echo. Um, yeah. And you would see a different style, I guess, of debate mediation if someone was actually tracking the substance of the debate and actually saying, okay, well, you just said that, so now what does the other person say about that? And then what is their answer? And then putting that answer back to the other person, and then finding what their response is to that, and then getting that response answered to. And it would be much better to follow that thread instead of just one person gives 2 minutes, another person gives 2 minutes, and then there's open discussion, which is obviously going to be talking over each other, especially if you don't let the actual issue get exhausted. If you don't actually let both people have their say until they've exhausted their say over that issue. Um, and then, Trump then is naturally cursed because he is there defending substance, and Joe Biden is using his time making scurrilous accusations and blanket complaints, which have to be debunked. And so, yes, then naturally Trump has to take more time. It just naturally does take more time, because in half a breath you can make an accusation that you need a paragraph to diffuse. So there is a fundamental asymmetry here. And Biden has the privilege that he doesn't have a platform, essentially. He doesn't have an actual target that you can talk about, because he's like water. He takes the container of anything. Oh, I'm not going to give an answer because then that would become the issue. It's a disgrace. I mean, for Chris Wallace to ask a question and to Joe Biden to flagrantly not answer the question, and then Chris Wallace just accepts his answer and then just takes that vague, nebulous narrative of complaining as his answer, which then obviously is for Trump to have to respond to. And then Trump is only given equal time. So Trump has to use his equal time to spend all of it defending against Joe Biden's broad accusations. It is structurally unfair. It is slimy. Yeah, so I am incredibly sympathetic to Trump on this account, and this, I mean, I'm sympathetic to anyone who has to debate anyone who has a kind of the identity politics narrative anyway. I mean, that was actually a small portion of the debate, but when you're dealing with that kind of intellectual movement and the kind of thinking, the kind of weak pseudo intellectual thinking, the circular reasoning, the circular arguments that make up that kind of worldview, and intellectuals that are being fed that narrative and that expect that narrative to be handed to them, it's it's a slimy thing to have to deal with. It's tough, and it takes quite a lot of effort and quite a lot of concerted effort to cut through the slime. It really does. It's hard because you have to kind of you have to find the chink in the armor, and then you have to target it, and you have to frame it just so that you can prove that what it is that they're saying here and now is this is the wool over people's eyes, um, is a dishonest intellectual, pseudo intellectual, it is a bad faith answer. It's a kind of chaos magic, is what they're kind of playing with. um, I mean, Trump's brilliance generally in dealing with these people is to just summarize their sentiments to some, because essentially that's all they are. They're just a bundle of sentiments because there's so poor intellectual thought put behind it, but they pretend to be the sympathetic ones. They pretend to be, all these things. I guess what Trump could have done that would have been better is not to think of specific quotes that Joe Biden had said, but to just call Joe Biden names, essentially, in terms of calling him a white supremacist, and that this whole identity politics is a disgusting form of white supremacy, and that it clouds people's judgment and it makes them not see reality. They can't even develop self-confidence because they have to go get this ideological self-esteem, which is fixed or obsessed with essentially trashing the country and trashing and calling the American experiment racist. It's fixed on this hate. This. I mean, Trump brought out some of these points, but to link it into the poor character of the person who is trying to represent that kind of trash. Um, that's a bit of a hard argument to make, or that's perhaps a bit of a hard sell to make. Because you have to make the claim, and then you do have to give a little bit of a chain of reasoning that links that up. And it can be hard to go through that explanation because it's a bit psychological as well, I guess. But what's disgusting is that the whole Joe Biden thing is that uh, I'm still, I guess, going back to this one ideological point where he says that people's self-esteem, uh, uh, the only way to the only way to appease these people's self-esteem and their subjective feelings that Joe feels sympathy over, sadly, is to take away the dignity and the integrity of not only the country but also a large amount of very decent people, which are being generalized into a disgusting slur, a disgusting prejudice against the fabric of the American nation and the people that make it up. And so, if your esteem is based essentially on insulting a whole section of the population just by some magical generalization, which is frankly racist, I mean, I guess Trump did bring up some of these notes, but to tie it up as this is the poison that is uh, uh, the real threat to having a successful democracy and to having a successful nation. Um, and that, well, how it's a losing formula, or how it's also immoral as well, I guess. Yeah, I mean, Trump did mention those things, but I think that they were worth repeating after Joe Biden said that thing about the self-esteem and the subjective feelings. That the only way to satisfy those subjective feelings and that self-esteem is that it's an incorrect way to get self-esteem, and it forces other people to have ideological targets on them of hate, which are frankly based on racial generalizations. And to even poke fun at their ideology, that their ideology is frankly that, well, because of supposedly a racial generalization, we're allowed to use racial generalizations to get even. You know, have you ever heard that two wrongs don't make a right? And what is the evidence that there is this wrong? But that hasn't even been politically championed properly. That, you know, the kind of the statistical, you know, if there is systemic oppression, the statistics don't back that up. But, you know, I guess, you know, they have so heavily charged it that I guess Trump can't even address those kinds of things directly. It's a bit because of the hyperrealism. Yeah, sadly, without the resources, yeah, I mean, so the thing that Daniel uh, talks about in a sense-making video, I guess, if that were out already, that would be quite nice to have that as a resource before a presidential debate, because based on that kind of level-headed assessment, perhaps you could even just get into the crux of these issues and see how pragmatic leaders are in terms of addressing the matters that are really unresolved and that are waiting for an answer, and how people, you know, you can sort of fast track to getting into the fertile contentiousness, and then work out, you know, which side you think has got more reason behind it, or is has more political clout in terms of their capability of designing a solution that is going to have any traction, um, in terms of how they've even defined, have they defined the problem carefully enough. uh, you know, that starts to become possible when you have a when you start having some sort of generally good sense making in the political arena, or you know, that people have access to. um, okay.